Welcome to the About podcast. Here we explore your financial health in simple and easy to understand ways.
All right, well, welcome everybody back to the About podcast, where we tackle all things personal financial health. My name is Jeremy Scott, one of your co-hosts here, joined ably as always by Roy Hookie as in Cookie. Roy,
yes.
How you doing today?
You know, I'm doing good. We have probably our biggest celebrity yet to be on the podcast.
Oh, I know. We haven't had a lot of public figures.
Yes, public figure. That's
yeah.
what we would call you today.
Yeah. Because today we are joined by a guest, which we love. We love our guests. It's always best. I want to say that, but we almost always have guests now. We're doing really good.
You know,
with
I'm
guests.
kind of enjoying it.
Yeah, me too. It's a lot of pressure off us. All the pressure's on
them.
them.
A lot of pressure off
so,
us. Yes.
The one in the hot seat today is Brenda Dones. She's the Weld County Assessor. Brenda, welcome.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Yeah. I think just right off the bat, what is an assessor? Just so people we'll set the table for everybody at home.
Absolutely. I think that's a good question because a lot of people don't know. But an assessor is every single county in the state of Colorado has an assessor. There's 64 counties in the state, so there are 64 assessors. 62 of us are elected officials.
Okay.
So the public actually votes in order for us to be able to get this job. 2 of the 64 are appointed. The other 62 are elected. And our job is to value property for the basis of property tax. We just do one piece of the property tax formula, but we value all property throughout the state at the exact same time, and it becomes the basis of property tax.
And you are elected.
I am elected.
Yeah. All right.
So if somebody listening at home is in Weld County, they're like, I know that name. I checked it, or I didn't. I can't imagine those are hotly contested elections, but
Probably
you never
not.
know. You never know.
Agreed. You never know. It's political.
Everything.
And so, as politics continues to be controversial, there's more challenges for the role.
What's the election cycle for your role?
Every 4 years.
Okay.
It's the opposite odd number from the presidential election.
Oh, okay.
So in 2 years, which would be 2027, so end of 2026, November is when the next election would happen for assessors across the state.
Oh, okay.
Right.
So similar like school boards and things like that, or school boards are on the off years, the odd years.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. I was on the school board here, so if I break out a question from there, I didn't warn you about that before we started, so
Yeah.
I have a little bit of knowledge around that. Actually, I might know a little bit about this more than you do.
You might, but it is a problem because you do still say we in regard to the school board.
I know.
He's no longer on it.
I'm not.
We have to remind him.
Listen, they're nice people. So Brenda, one, how does somebody get into assessing? I mean,
how did you get here?
Do you just drive around going, I wonder how much that house is worth and make that a career, or?
Wow. Well, that was not how I got here.
Oh, okay. I don't figure that's what.
You were a little girl being like, I'd really like to assess that value
Yeah,
of that
exactly.
property.
I really don't know that anybody starts their childhood going, I want to be an assessor. Because as we just said, most people don't have a clue what it is. But I actually went to college, got a degree in math. When I got that
me
degree.
too.
You did?
Yes.
Yes. See?
University of Wyoming.
Oh, I was University of Northern Colorado.
Oh.
So-
Well, we're not really quite, enemies, I guess, but
No.
Montana State, I got you all beat.
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
yes. For lowest quality, you mean?
No Bobcats. Computer science, applied math. There you go.
Anyway, so
Nice.
back to your mathematics
No,
degree.
applied math is what this is all about.
Yeah.
So, I thought I was going to teach. I did teach for a couple years.
I
And
did
then,
as well.
See,
Roy.
look at the commonalities we have. Exactly.
I can maybe assess one day.
You
Ooh,
could.
your third career.
I don't think so. I really like what I do.
I do too.
Good.
I really like what I do. It's a lot of statistics. I ended up becoming an appraiser. I moved into a role of being the senior analyst for Weld County Assessor's office. Then I moved up to chief deputy assessor, and then I was elected assessor. But we use a lot of data, so it's all data driven. We're using a lot of sales information and other economic information, and we use a lot of statistics in order to help us value property. So that's sort of how you get into it.
So you jumped really quickly from math teacher. Well, you said teaching. Were you a math teacher?
I was
Okay, math teacher. High school?
high school,
Good for you.
Me too. To a appraiser.
right?
How did that happen?
Well, I It was interesting. The times were different. I actually had left Colorado in order to go to Las Vegas and teach, and then decided that Las Vegas wasn't a place where I wanted to live. It was hot. It was rough. It was not the kind of educational opportunities I wanted to provide. And so when I came back to Colorado, I didn't get a teaching job. So I needed a position. Gosh, had to pay those bills. And so there was an appraiser job that was available. And when I was teaching, I had actually done some geometry and applied math, showing how you can use geometry to figure out house sizes and make adjustments on property. And so I thought, well, I know how to do this. I'm going to apply for the appraiser job. I thought it would be short-lived. I didn't think I would stay there very long. But I started as an appraiser. I actually ended up going to the State Division of Property Taxation and teaching appraisers, and then back to the county. So, it's that strange one door closes and another one opens, and you just sort of end up where you are.
You're bringing back memories of my teaching days when I would actually I taught geometry as well, and we would always do you'd have a student stand, you'd measure their height and their shadow, right? And then you would pick objects that are much taller, and then you would have to calculate how high they were, right?
Right.
So the kids always enjoyed that because you got to go outside.
Yeah.
Do the fun stuff there.
Geometry was great because it is
geometry.
a lot of applied
I
math.
love geometry. I was really good at geometry.
Wait, we're geeking out right now. I'm sure that
And statistics. I love statistics.
our guests, our listeners, hopefully you don't tune us out.
Yeah, you're like, boring.
Math.
Math done.
Well, it's interesting you came in that way, because I think for most people in their regular lives, where they probably run into assessment is more on the, like, I just bought a house this last spring, on the appraisal side, right? And it's like, and basically, is this, and the question is this worth enough that I can get the loan that I need, on it? That kind of thing. So I think that's where probably, so it makes sense that that's a path one would go to.
Absolutely. So first, congratulations on the purchase of your home. That's big. Big thing. And the methods that you used or that you saw an appraiser use in order to determine whether the value of your property was what you were getting your loan for and whether it was reasonable for paying for that are the exact same methods that we use in the assessor's office. The difference is that when you're getting that for a private individual purpose, they're only looking at one property and pulling 3 or 4 comparable sales in order to estimate the value. And when the assessor does it, we're trying to revalue all property as of the exact same date. So we're using the mass of sales that occurred in that time frame in order to estimate the value of every single property.
Right.
So that's why we're using statistics. We don't have enough people in our office in order to do it one at a time.
Right. Oh my gosh, could you imagine?
Oh, I can't.
So do you use AI?
Well, it depends on how you want to describe it. So we absolutely use statistical models. We use multiple regression in order to figure it out. And we use AI in order to help us hone in on the different relationships on the variables. So variables meaning the square footage of your house, the basement finish of your house,
Number of bathrooms,
number of bathrooms in your house, garage size, whether it's attached or detached. And so we're using statistics and AI in order to bring it together and try to come up with a formula for every house that we can apply so that they're all treated the same. Right. So our job is to be fair and equitable. We don't want one property that's one-story, 1,800 square foot house that's right next to or down the road from another house that's one-story, 1,800 square feet. We want them to be treated the same.
Are one of those variables, I just had this conversation recently where somebody was looking at a property and it was in a metro district, okay? But the property was less costly purchase price. So like, wow, look at this price.
Right.
And then you see a metro and an HOA and that's all layered on there, but it seems like those houses are getting valued at less value. Is that a variable that you guys have to look at?
It is a variable we consider because we have to consider anything that's affecting the sale price. And what we see is that when you're in an area that's going to have higher tax, particularly a metro district or high HOA fees, then there is a chance that the sale price will be less. So what we do is we group the properties together by location based on whether they're in a metro district or not in a metro district. And then we use those properties in order to value the other properties that are similar to them. So we do consider it.
So your subsets are very similar in that regard, but you do have to pull those apart and be able to look at them side by apples to apples, if you will.
Absolutely.
And that makes sense. A lot of people are shopping payment.
Right.
Right. And when it comes down to it, that's at the end of the day, when you're comparing houses, it's what's my monthly payment going to be?
Was it us talking about that?
We did talk about
You
it.
looked at a
were-
property somewhere that had that, didn't you?
Yeah.
That was us.
You related that story, and then we had a follow-up conversation about it.
Yeah,
Roy
okay.
and I talk a lot.
Yeah, we do. We can't remember what we're talking about.
So I get for like a loan purpose, or for my, if I'm doing that, why the bank wants to know that I'm not borrowing more than the house is worth, and that kind of thing. Why does the county want to know how much my house is worth?
Yeah.
And understanding I already know the answer.
Right. Absolutely. So, and it's not just the county, it's all of the local governments that are beneficiaries of property tax. And so Colorado Constitution says that every property will pay property tax unless it's specifically exempt by law. And so there are...
We're recording this in a church, by the way, for those at home who don't understand the gesticulation I just made pointing at the floor. It's like we are pointing at the church because the church is property tax exempt.
Absolutely. So charitable, religious, school-related, those are properties that are exempt from taxation. Every other property is taxable. And it's pretty amazing because we will tax things you can see and things you can't see. So oil and gas is a good example.
Yeah.
We even tax oil and gas. So although you're not going to see that coming out of the ground, or maybe sand and gravel or other, wind, we still are required to tax all of that. And so every single property is taxable. And the funding from the tax goes to all of the local governments and education.
So is the county the authority on the value then? Nobody else is, like, the state's not also evaluating the value of my property, right? They're relying on your valuations as the county.
That's correct.
And my city is relying on your valuations as a county.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes, so every county assessor is responsible for those values. And then our piece is the valuation. The local governments or the schools, then they get to set one piece of the formula, but it's just a tax rate. They get to set their own tax rate. So in order to get from our value to property tax, you take our value, you multiply it by the state rate, because there is a state rate so that every property in the state gets treated the same. And then there's a local rate. And so it'll be your local county, your local city, your local school district, your local metro district. All of those rates get added together, multiply it all together, and you get the tax.
Right.
So I recently took a tour of the fire hall. We have a new fire hall here in town.
Nice.
It's quite nice. And they pass or they have a mill is what they call it, right? And that is actually part of what you're referencing, right? So that's part of your guys is collecting that money, and that money goes to fund our fire services in this specific area.
That's exactly right. So that local tax rate that every local government sets is called a mill levy. And every one of those local governments sets it independently. They base it on the overall value of the property in their area so that they can tell how much revenue do we need. We're going to have to take the value, multiply it by this mill levy to determine the amount of revenue that we need. But that's it. You calculate by that mill levy, you figure out what the fire district receives in property tax, and then those are the operating dollars that they use in order to provide their services.
So, we talked about the little nuance the other day with, so a school passes a bond. Are you guys collecting that as well as part of that?
Yep.
Okay, so how do you collect the difference, being that you were saying that Jeremy was saying the school district gets X dollars. So if you have more properties, you guys have to adjust your calculation to be able to pull in the right amount of money?
So school districts in particular can have up to 3 different tax rates. They have an operating or a general mill levy.
Got it.
That's for operating purposes. They can have a bond levy. So if the voters have approved capital construction, in Johnstown, Milliken, they approved capital construction and a bond levy.
Yeah, we did.
That's a separate fund. And then there can be a mill levy override. And that mill levy override helps with teacher salaries and special programs. And same thing, that's voter approved. Voters have to decide if they want to have a mill levy override. In Johnstown, Milliken, I believe they have a mill levy override as well. So they have 3 different levies that they apply to the value. So we take the value, we multiply that by the statewide rate, then we multiply it by each individual levy, and the money that comes in from each one of those individual buckets stays in those buckets. And so we keep track of that for them. But then once we distribute the money back to the school district in those separate buckets, they're responsible for how they use it. And taxpayers are responsible for making sure that they believe they're using it wisely.
That's a lot of work for you guys to keep all that straight.
Well, I think it's interesting because like what I found out when I was on the school board was like, so for our mill levies, like we will authorize a dollar amount. So we're going to collect $4 million a year. This year, so every year we have to certify what the actual tax rate is because it depends on, well, how much is out there, right? We're going to collect $4 million from all the houses. Well, there's more houses today than there were before, right? And
Absolutely.
so you have to, so you're also adjusting the rate, hopefully, if in a growing area, we're adjusting the rate down because you've got more people sharing the burden.
Yes.
But we can only ever collect that dollar amount. So even with a bond, like we collect the dollar amount for the bond. So more houses, more businesses, more everything. People are, there's a sharing of the load that happens, which is great for the taxpayer. But what people don't understand is that for the school district, they don't get any more money because there's new houses, right? I mean, for the mill levy override and through the bonds, there's no extra cash. It's just the people paying in is just a wider pool of people supporting that dollar amount, which is different than like local taxes, fire hall, and everything else. They are seeing, like the local town is seeing additional revenue from those additional sources because they're not trying to collect a dollar amount; they're collecting an actual like percentage.
Yeah.
And it gets. I can understand why taxpayers do not understand this process.
It is
right.
very confusing.
And we had to do a lot of educating when we practiced past our mill, or people, our citizens will come in and say, "Oh, there's all these houses now. You guys are getting all this extra money." And I'm like, "Well, I'm sorry, the school district, not we.
Very good.
The
sir.
school district is not, but other entities are."
Right.
Because it depends. There's so many different flavors these come in.
And it depends even within school districts. So some school districts are passing mill levy overrides that are set at a certain number of mills.
Right.
And other school districts are saying, no, we want a certain number of dollars. And so even across education, it can be confusing because they can all be different. And so that's why it's so easy for this process to be confusing. It's because it's not consistent. It depends on how the school board decided what was best for them. They decided what was best for them, and then they went and asked voters for that.
Right.
Well, that's kind of how it came up. Was the Front Range Fire is who it is, and they said they haven't increased their bills in quite some time, but theirs is flat across everybody. So even though they haven't increased it, they're getting more revenue because Johnstown area just passed over 20,000. I think the police chief just told us. So that growth is supporting the growth of our fire district that we need for the increased services and all that good stuff.
I would provide a clarification on it, though. All property value goes into that bucket that funds fire districts, for example, or any other local government. And even though residential growth continues to increase and we're seeing more value overall, we also have to include commercial and industrial property. We have to include vacant land.
Agriculture.
We have to include agriculture. We have to include oil and gas. And those other categories tend to be more volatile.
Yeah.
Right.
They go up, they go down, they go up,
Oil
they go
and gas
down.
especially.
Oh, oil and gas especially.
Yeah.
And then the second piece of it is that because value continues to go up, the state continues to lower the statewide rate. And so even though value might go up 10% in Johnstown, for example, the statewide rate might drop 8%. And so then the fire district is only seeing that net
right.
of
So what
2%.
I'm hearing is it's nuanced and it's not
Absolutely.
straightforward.
Of course. There's enough moving pieces that it varies for every property.
Yeah. It's quite a math equation when you get your little property tax thing at the end of the year.
Yeah.
It's explaining what happened. And I do think you brought up an important point. The thing that is important to understand is that, that we have different kinds of property that are taxed and this is all obviously Colorado, that are taxed at different rates. And one of the things that I think as a community, like our community, the Johnstown Milliken community has struggled with is we have a lot of housing, which is taxed at the lowest rate.
Correct.
We don't have a lot of business and commercial, a lot of oil and gas, which is at the highest rate, but that is the most volatile. So it's a very weird kind of dynamic. And I don't envy, local governments trying to figure it out or plan because you just don't know. But I know I have very much been celebrating the increase in commercial. in our area, like when the new Buc-ee's went in and Ledge Rock went in and everything. I literally will check the maps. I'm like, is that in the school district? Like, it's like who gets it? Because they're not only these large valuable buildings that are going to be taxed at a decent rate no matter what, because they're just worth millions or whatever, but they're also taxed at a higher rate,
right?
And so they're going to pay in more,
right?
Which makes sense if you think about it. I mean, these are properties that are generating income, right?
So, a question on that regard is how is that determined? How does the local government figure that out and how they rate everything?
Yeah, so in terms of the statewide rate, which is what makes the difference between residential property, commercial property, industrial property, oil and gas, that's that statewide rate that's set across the entire state. It used to be based on what was called the Gallagher Amendment, but the Gallagher Amendment was repealed by the voters of Colorado in 2020. And so now it's determined by the legislature. So every year, the legislature has a chance to look at what that statewide rate should be for those different groupings of property, and they establish what that assessment rate should be. They are only allowed, because of the Tabor Amendment, they're only allowed to reduce the rate. They're not allowed to increase the rate because it would be a tax increase and it would have to go back to voters of the public. And that's what Tabor says. And so they will look at the assessment rate for residential, for example. It used to be 7.2%, then they dropped it to 7.1%, then they dropped it a little bit more to 6.8%. But in order to raise it back up, they have to write specific language that says this is temporary. So we rarely see increases in the rate, just decreases in the rate. So they're very tentative to want to reduce the rate too much for fear that we're going to have a recession, property value will drop. And then the overall tax for our local governments won't be enough in order to be able to provide the services.
So how do you, I'm just thinking of some examples in my head of like, residential versus business. And how do you determine if someone's running a home-based business? In the world, we're on a podcast right now, and there's people that run podcasts that make a lot of money. Mm-hmm. And it could all be from their basement, but we're doing it from a nonprofit church.
Right.
Just to be clear. So just to be clear. But how,
and I didn't know that.
Say somebody has a podcast.
And we don't make any money at this.
Right.
This to be clear.
We make $0.
You have listened to no ads in this thing. There's no money.
Right.
I always say, be careful what you share with the assessor.
Right. But that's the concept, right? So how how does that play into everything? Because there could be really $1 million businesses that run out of the home that they don't have to pay the tax rate that I would have to pay because I have a storefront downtown.
Right. That's absolutely true. And the assessor does the majority of our work from outside of the property. So it's rare for an assessor or an appraiser that works for the assessor's office to be invited into a house. People are worried. They're afraid that we're going to see something that's going to result in a higher tax bill.
You don't get many party invites, do you?
Not very many at all. But I do get neighbors that'll call up and go, "Did you know their basement's finished?"
Oh.
So we get those people that tattle.
I don't like that at all.
No comment on the basement finishing.
So we check the outside of the property. So if there's somebody running a business out of their basement, there's a high possibility that we don't know about it, and we wouldn't value it that way anyway because we're valuing the building, what the building is most likely going to be used for, what the building will most likely sell for. So the primary purpose of the structure. But if you're downtown and you're on a storefront or you're a retail shop or something like that, it's most likely going to sell that way, and that's how we're going to value it. And we value it that way and we classify it that way. So
that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. I think it's in my world, property taxes are interesting and just within the life of the church because again, like nonprofits and I think hospitals too, if they're a nonprofit hospital. In certain situations, we don't pay property taxes. But my wife is a pastor and she's a pastor downtown and they have a lot of people who use and rent space from them. And so they do pay property taxes on part of the building space. And they have this whole, they have to track what's used for what and how much income's coming in, but it's worthwhile because the income coming in far exceeds, what they end up having to pay out in property taxes, and they just factor that into the rent.
Right. Absolutely.
Right. And actually, I was at a seminar for clergy the other day, and one of the whole sessions was "Don't be afraid of property taxes." It's seen as this kind of big bugaboo, but it may make financial sense to think about pulling some of your building out of, and you don't have to pull the whole thing, but pulling some of the building out of the exemption that you can then go and make money on. If you just need to factor that into the rent you're charging and things like that. And they are able to fund a lot of ministry by doing that, and it works for them. So I mean, I think it's they're paying their fair share, which they should do. Right. So it can get, even within a building, I think it can get complicated, in that regard, because, they're not renting out the sanctuary. They're not renting out the whole building. So some of it is exempt, but some of it is not, because they have outside groups.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to know that properties aren't exempt just because there's a church operating in it. They have to apply for a property tax exemption. And so every property is taxable unless specifically exempt, and you have to apply to get that exemption. And so that's where a church would have to say, yep, we're using this part of our building for daycare, and we're charging for that. And so that's going to be a taxable portion. But it's up to them to be able to track what the square footage is, what the value is, and report it in so that we can give them an exemption on some of it and not on the other. That's a state function. Interestingly enough, exemptions are a statewide function. So there's a statewide division of property taxation, and they manage that and then report back to the local county assessor. That's so that we're all consistent, so that I can't show bias to maybe my own congregation and say, oh, I'm going to exempt this property because I like the people there. So in order to make sure that assessors are fair, the state manages that.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So can you give us some perspective on Weld County, Colorado? How much of the revenue generated comes from residential, commercial, oil and gas, or the different categories that you guys actually track?
Yeah, absolutely. I brought notes.
I figured you did. You had a pile of stuff
I know
on
I have
your
a pile
lap
of stuff here because
we better get into some of this.
I know. She came prepared. She brought her homework. We got to ask her about it.
You don't have to ask me about it. But there's so many numbers, and it changes every single year.
Yeah.
And so I brought notes just to make sure that I didn't.
I'm sure you love it when people capture you at the grocery store. It's like, hey, by the way, can you tell me blah blah blah? And they're like, no. I don't have that at the top of my head.
I do get a lot of grocery store questions. So
do I, but mine are about Jesus.
Oh.
So,
Mine are financial questions, typically.
The three of us should just hang out at the grocery store and see what happens.
See who gets the most questions.
Yeah.
Just run it as a game, right? So you're holding a document here. What year is this from?
This is from 2024.
Good.
So this is our most recent document because we closed out the end of 2024. This is where we are right now. And so overall assessed valuation for all of Weld County, we're over $19.6 billion. Again, that's assessed dollars, meaning that we've already multiplied the actual value by the statewide assessment rate. If I were to be telling you the actual value of all property in Weld County, I would be somewhere close to $650 billion of actual value just in Weld County.
Right, because as you said earlier, the residential rate is like 7%.
Right.
So like your house worth $500,000, but you're 7% of the $500,000 is what you're getting taxed on.
Right. It's what the statewide rate is, and then it's even lower than that because we now apply the local rates. So you're getting your taxable portion of your property is 7%, and then you pay much less than that because the next rate gets applied as well.
Yeah. And
so,
what for business and commercial, it's
right now, and same thing, I almost need notes because it's changing so frequently, but it's right about 27% right now for businesses.
Right.
But
so if I have a commercial property, it's 27%. If I'm home, 7%. This is why I keep saying, I tell people all the time, commercial is good. Like, you want, if you care about the tax base in your community, those people are paying way more, for those. Yeah.
Right. I mean, you have to consider all perspectives. Commercial is good for those local governments and the schools that are receiving that revenue. But commercial business owners feel like they're paying too much. And so
certainly.
One of the things that the legislature one of the things the legislature continues to hear is that there needs to be a smaller differential between residential and commercial property. And they've been taking that into consideration over the last couple of years. When Gallagher was repealed, that allowed the legislature to make that change. And so we're seeing the commercial rate drop about 1% every year for the next several years. So it's going to come down to about 25%, and then the legislature will have a chance to review it again to decide how to handle it.
Before you get into your numbers, I'm sure listeners are thinking this too. So you have actual value, you have assessed value. Why do we have to go through all those nuances and not just make your multiplier on your actual value, and instead of having to go to assessed value and then doing the math on the assessed value, and then that's what you actually pay? Why isn't it just actual value times some sort of percentage to get to the taxes owed?
is actual value times some sort of percentage, but it does vary by property type. And again, that's because the Gallagher Amendment set that up as a requirement in 1982, and it's been required to be that way until 2020. And so now we're trying to gradually make that make more sense, make it a little easier for taxpayers to understand. But it takes time because you can't just adjust those percentages and still have the revenue needed for government to provide the services that it does.
Sure.
Right. I suppose we should have a disclaimer at the beginning of this one. If you're a listener outside the state of Colorado, feel free to go make some breakfast. Or, no.
We don't know their rules. Every state has their own rules.
Yeah. Well, the good thing is, though, they need to understand their own rules wherever they live. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So go dig into that if you don't know.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so numbers. Let's hear some numbers.
Let's see. Let's look at let's see. What should we look at? We should look at who pays the most, who has the highest value, and that's oil and gas. As you described earlier, oil and gas carries the burden of property value in Weld County. They're assessed at 87.5%. So you were saying residential is assessed at about 7%. And oil and gas is at 87.5%. So not only is their value really high, but their assessment rate is really high. And so they carry the burden of property value and property tax in Weld County.
So for our listeners then, if you're looking at a $100,000 piece of property that's oil and gas or a $100,000 piece of property that's residential, $7,000 is taxable for the residential. $87,500 is taxable for the oil and gas.
Correct.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. So a significant difference. And so out of our total $19 billion value in Weld County, $11.5 billion sits in oil and gas. So that's it's almost 60%. 60% of the Weld County value is in oil and gas.
And is that is assessed when it's pulled out of the ground?
Correct.
So if it's just sitting in the ground, then not so much. But it's and I think that's part of the route logic for the higher rate is you're not paying it unless you've actually pulled it out of the ground and you're going to sell it. And it gets factored into the cost.
Yep. So it's just like every other property. We value it based on what it can be sold for.
Right.
And so we value oil and gas based on the amount of product that they get out of the ground and what they can sell it for.
Yeah. So immediately understand where the volatility comes in.
Oh, crazy volatility. Yeah. Yes, because oil and gas is a market that is global.
Yeah.
And so price goes up, price goes down, price goes up, price goes down. So even if production in Weld County is stable the entire time, the value changes drastically because that price of oil, that price of natural gas changes so much.
And we know the production isn't standard because they're adjusting production based on value too. Right.
Production changes. It's been more stable recently, but it does change based on what those oil and gas companies are wanting to do. Yeah. So oil and gas is our biggest. Residential pays about 17%, and so they make up about 17% of our full pie of value. So
is that number two?
That's number two. Yep.
So
that's
oil and gas was 60.
Yep. Oil and gas was 60.
In first place, number two is 17.
Right.
Okay. Much difference.
Yep. And then if we put commercial and industrial property together, they combined are 17%.
Okay.
Yeah. So those are our top. Those are our top
three.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, top three.
The big bigs, that's like 94%.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And so then who gets the tax? Who receives the tax? Schools. Schools are the number one receiver of property tax, the way it was intended to be. Mm-hmm. I mean, property tax is all about making sure that we can fund a free public education. That was the way it was back in the 1800s. And so that's the way it still is. Right now, education gets about 40% of all of the property tax revenue in Weld County.
Interesting.
Yep. The county gets about 20%, and then cities and towns make up about 7%. In addition, we have junior colleges. Fire districts are at 10%.
Okay.
Yeah. And then metro districts are part of this, and their percentage continues to increase.
Do you get boos when you say metro district?
I do.
I kind of want to boo right now.
Mm-hmm. Kind of do.
I know.
I think they're necessary in some ways, but they're just there.
They're really challenging from an assessor's perspective because they have a high mill levy. So they can have 50 mills, 60 mills on just that single property, whereas schools would average 35, 40 mills by the time you add in their three different options: operating levy, mill levy override, bond levy. But metro districts, they have a really high mill levy. But you have to ask yourself, do you believe that growth should pay for itself? Because if you believe growth should pay for itself, then the way you're looking at it is we're going to grow this area, we're going to build this subdivision, and there has to be revenue in order to do that. But it's split only over those properties. If you don't have a metro district, then the city, Johnstown, for example, and all of the residents of Johnstown have to see an increase in their mill levy in order to pay for that subdivision. Now, it's split across more people, but you, as the owner of a property that's in an existing part of town, might not believe that it's valuable for you to be paying for the new subdivision that's out west.
And that's where you get those small towns that are like, growth bad.
Right.
Because they just have to pay more in tax, right?
Exactly.
So you get that battle that goes on. It's a nuanced thing, because you think about it, as a community grows, it'd be nice to everybody has, a hand in that, versus, only the people in that community are paying for that metro, and they're, but other people can come in there and enjoy the facilities.
Right.
Right?
I know.
But they're not paying for it.
I know. There's good and bad.
Yeah.
That's all there is to it. I think the hardest part from an assessor's perspective is that the mill levy is high, and so it can double somebody's property tax bill. We would see a normal property, normal, that's a terrible word. We would see a traditional property with not being in a metro district with a tax bill of $3,000, $3,500. But when you move into a metro district, you're going to see $6,000 for your tax bill.
Yeah, that's a lot.
We were factoring it in because we were looking at a bunch of different places. We were looking to maybe build, and it's just like, all right, you got to do the math. It's like, well, this house is $60,000 cheaper, and I'm like, yeah. But is it? I mean, it's just like,
the payment's more for some reason.
Right. Yeah. So
figure out. Now, when did those? Just I'm out of curiosity. When did metro taxes? Did the state legislature allow this? Like, how did these come about? Do you have any detail on that? Just because that's really something people are talking a lot about nowadays.
Right. Metro districts have been in existence for a very long time. I believe it was the 90s when we started seeing our first metro districts in Colorado. Highlands Ranch, which is a large area on the south side of Denver.
Desirable place to be.
Desirable place to be. Believe it or not, it is not in a town. It's an unincorporated, so it is located just in the county. And that was one of our first metro districts that we ever saw. That was the way they were able to put in that development. And so Highlands Ranch, if you think back to when that was built, I believe it was early 90s. It was one of the first times we saw a metro district that really was large and taxed people in order to be able to build that development.
It's funny because you learn anything about where it comes from and it makes more sense. You're like, well, of course, there's no town to support that, so they have to have the people they're going to do that do there. Well, if you live in a town now and there's a metro, like, it's kind of double duty.
Right. And I think towns were really trying to figure out, how are we going to continue to pay for growth? Are they going to continue to raise the mill levy? At the same time, the Tabor Amendment in 1982 was saying, you towns don't have the ability to raise your levy. You can't tax people more. And so there was this conflict, and they had to figure out a way to still be able to grow. And metro districts are one of the options.
Well, and in Johnstown specifically, Jeremy, you being a newer resident in the area, they did not used to allow metro. But they had to compete with, like, builders won't come to our town because they'll go somewhere else where they can have that metro tax, right? Because then they don't have to pay that or lobby the town to help them or whatever it is.
Otherwise, they're up fronting all the money.
Yeah, so they had to start allowing those into the community so that we could compete on growth for homes and the population, right?
Absolutely.
Well, and I think that's one of the things people don't quite get is that, I mean, and so the other side of it is, okay, so if you don't do the metro tax, which is one of those ways of facilitating growth, then you're taking supply out of a system that still has increased demand. Well, what then happens to everybody's prices? Well, if you're already a homeowner, that's great. If you're not, our prices are already ridiculous anyway, in my opinion, for homes and things like that. I mean, imagine, otherwise. But I think the broader point is that tax policy around these things will shape things more than people realize, right? I mean, especially if you're a business, you're going to be very sensitive to it. I remember even on oil and gas, I remember when the Bakken oil field up in Montana was very, very popular. You'd look at the map on where all the oil wells were done, and they were all on the North Dakota side of the border. And they literally stopped at the Montana border, and the only difference was how the two states assess property taxes. Right. And so the oil and gas companies think, well, it's way more economical for us to drill, so we're going to drill every possible thing we can in North Dakota before we hop the border, even though there's plenty of oil under the ground in eastern Montana. The formation goes there, but it's like, nope, we're not going to do it because it's just way more expensive from a tax perspective to do it in Montana than it is in North Dakota. So literally there's this bright line down the map. And Montana kind of missed out on a lot of the revenue that it would have otherwise received all just very simply because of how it taxed
Right.
the property, and it taxed the oil and gas coming out.
Right.
Which, here or there, whether you think about that, but it did shape things. And so I think, tax policy does shape things. I mean, you can understand, once I got into it, I understand like, oh, this is why towns will offer, tax breaks or whatever to bring in businesses who are going to pay those higher rates. If you're thinking, oh, this place is going to be here for 50 years, maybe we'll give them a break for a little while, and go from there.
Absolutely.
So then to come back around full circle, your specific role gets to calculate how to value. Then you could run the calculations on that to then get to the number that is paid. And then you guys actually do you guys actually bring in the revenue and then distribute it, or is that a different department?
That's a different department. So the treasurer's office does all of the collection and distribution. So assessor's office takes all of the data in. We actually calculate the tax because we have all of the numbers. Somebody submitted to us. We've calculated the value. We know what the state assessment rate is. All of the local governments have provided to us their rates. So we'll calculate the tax, but then we deliver it to the treasurer's office. They do all the billing, they do all the collection, and they do all the distribution of it.
That's a nice for you to not have to deal with that.
Yeah.
It is nice.
So you're not actually the tax man.
I'm not the tax man.
Okay.
So no, I'm the value
That's good because
person.
tax collectors don't do well in church.
Yeah. There's a few verses about those guys.
Right. So, but we do set the value, and I think this has been. I think one of the things property owners need to remember is that they might not always have a say in what the statewide rate is. They can go to their local governments and talk about what their local rate should be. So they can go to the school district and say, we think that you should lower your mill levy. They can go to the fire district.
Do.
I know. They can go to the fire district and say, we think you're not providing the service or we need a different levy. But they can also come to the assessor and talk about their value. So the very first piece of that formula of how to get to property tax is a piece that property owners should be involved in. They should know what their value of their property is. And if they don't like the value, they don't think it's right, they should actually come tell the assessor. And we get a lot of people that also come tell us, just like they're going to come tell the school district that they think the levy should be lowered, they're going to come tell us that their value should be lowered. But it's their right. So they should take advantage of the opportunity to interact with the pieces they can change.
So you're making it sound like there's a process.
There is a process.
Okay. Could you tell us more about that?
Absolutely. So every 2 years, assessors across the state, so it doesn't matter where you are in Colorado, it's all the same. Every 2 years, assessors across the state revalue all property. And we revalue all property every odd numbered year. So we're in 2025 right now as we're talking. And so assessors are revaluing property in 2025. On May 1 of every odd numbered year, all property owners across the state are going to get notified of what their value is. And that value is going to establish their taxes for the next 2 years. But it's based on data that occurred, economics, that occurred up until June 30th of the prior even numbered year. So again, if we're in 2025, we're going to get your notice of value on May 1st of 2025, and it's from June 30th of 2024. So you want to know what your value should have been, meaning what would your property have sold for on June 30th of 2024, and you want to make sure the assessor gets that value really close when you get that notice of value on May 1st. If you don't like it, you can protest your value. You can tell the assessor that they didn't do a good job, and there's, a process. They do have to file an appeal with our office, and they can have that property value reviewed.
But they have to do it kind of as that snapshot in time. So thinking I have in my head right now is like 2008-9. We have a gigantic housing collapse. So in June, let's say it's the high of the market, just happens to be, and now we're 6 months later, 7 months later, and the market is going down. But you're like, today my property's worth less. But you're like, well, we're valuing it off of June. And in June, it was this.
Right.
And there's no real, you don't get anything for that. It just was that snapshot in time, and that's just the way the rule is written.
It is.
Okay.
It is the way the rule is written. So if June is the peak of the market and the market starts to go down after that, we are required to, we call it put the blinders on. We have to stop our economic analysis as of June 30th of that even year and then set that value. We'll consider that change in the market 2 years later. So we're supposed to use that full 2 years worth of data in order to be able to estimate the value. If the market is still down June 30th, 2 years later, that's when you get to see that reduction in your property value.
Okay.
Got it.
So say hypothetically you bought a house on May 23rd, 2024.
Hypothetically.
Then hypothetically.
With a basement or without a basement?
Shush. But I mean, it should, when I get it, I mean, it should look, I mean, it should be, would it be pretty close?
Yes.
I mean, to what, I mean, if a house has sold recently, is that, you're just like, okay, now we know the number. That's obviously what it's worth because that's what they bought it for. Or is there still some nuance in there?
It will be pretty close. But we don't take every single sale and say that's exactly the value of that property. We're looking at all of the properties in your neighborhood, and we're saying maybe you paid $5,000 less because you were a great negotiator.
Right. So I got a screaming deal.
You got a screaming deal. And so just because you got a screaming deal doesn't mean your property value will be less. We're going to go ahead and look at all of the properties in the area in order to estimate what that value should be. Or if you purchased it maybe in January and we still have until June in order to value it, then we're going to be looking at the economic changes that have occurred during that time period, up or down, in order to make sure we've taken your sale price and we've adjusted it based on the economics in order to try to figure out what the right value is.
Okay. So how does that, I mean, and I'm just curious, we talked about change of value, you know, obviously finishing a basement's a good one, or you added a building or, you know, whatever. How do you know? Like, how do you know if there's been, if I don't sell my property, like I've lived there for 20 years, I've done all kinds of stuff to it. Like, how do you know what I did? I mean, if I added value to my property.
Why she doesn't get invited to parties.
I know. And I was like, is there like a van?
She doesn't know.
Is there a van that like drives around and is like looking in your backyard going, that's a nice shed you got back there. There's $5,000 on your property tax.
No. Okay. I'm just going to be clear on
I
that
don't
one.
want that job. That guy's getting
It's like
shot.
code
Right.
enforcement
Sorry, but
for the police
yeah, I
officer.
don't know. Oh,
No,
don't want
thank
to do
you.
that job.
No, thank you.
We're notified of building permits.
Oh, yeah.
And so
That's what I kind of figured.
Yeah, so cities and towns will communicate to us building permits that have been taken out on different properties. So if you've finished your basement and you haven't taken out a building permit, then most likely the assessor doesn't know that your basement is finished unless a neighbor has shared with us.
Yeah. Well, we put a shed in our backyard, and they were very intentional. Like, well, if you build it this way, then you don't have to pull a permit. And I'm like, that's below the permit limit for Johnstown. Is if you build it this size. I'm like, well, let's build it that size.
Right.
Well, you know, interesting.
If
so,
not really, honestly, less for taxes and more just makes it easier.
Hassle.
Of course.
Or
Yes.
hassle. So I actually finished a basement in a house I used to own here in Johnstown, and I remember because I did pull permits and I did it all above board.
I don't know why you keep looking at me.
But it was funny because, you know, I work full time, and but there was a notice on my door one day that said, "Hey, we'd like to look inside your home," kind of thing. And I'm like, "Geez, what am I going to get this?" I never responded, by the way. So they just did. It said they would do an assumption
Right.
at that point, and they had to assume something, right?
Right.
So.
Yeah, so we use any details we get from a building permit in particular. So if that if your house is 1,200 square feet and it says that you finished 800 square feet, we believe that to be accurate, and so we'll estimate it based on 800 square feet.
Yeah.
And if there's no building permit, like I said, oftentimes we don't know. Then the property sells. We go to review the sale to try to figure out whether that's a sale we should use to value other property. And suddenly we discover there's a basement finish, and so we'll put that on at that time. But we don't go back and tax somebody after they've sold the property. So.
But you could, technically.
Well, you'd have to know when they did it.
Anyway.
No, we could, but we don't.
You don't. But yeah, that was just one of those nuances because I'm like, I just didn't have time to be at my house to let somebody in to look at my basement, for 2 seconds.
It's very common for people to not invite the assessor in. Oftentimes they'll call, though, and just say, yeah, I finished my basement and it's only this much. Or, yep, the building permit was accurate.
Are they just looking for like what they think it's actually worth or the amount of materials you put into it? Or because then it's like even hard. Like, I just did a building downtown, and we talked about this previously, but I have no idea what it's worth. It's not worth what I paid for it, right? But it's not like worth dollar for dollar more for whatever materials I put into it either. So I don't even know what it's worth.
Right, absolutely. So on residential, we're looking just say we value property based on generic characteristics because, again, we don't get inside every property. And so we're looking at the most basic characteristics that somebody that wants to buy that property will look for.
Bedrooms and bathrooms and square footage.
Square footage, location.
Sure.
Always
yeah.
location.
Always.
And then
No metro tax.
maybe square footage, bedrooms, bathrooms, that kind of thing.
Yeah. That makes sense. And then if it's, I guess the same thing if like it's a change of use, like somebody's got, residential, but you have a friend who's, taking some property and they're putting like an RV parking lots that people can pay and pay hourly. So it's a change of use. So you're monitoring things like change of use, but that's a zoning thing too. So I imagine you get notified if somebody changes their zoning from agricultural to whatever it is. And
we actually don't use zoning specifically.
Oh, really?
But we do track change of use if it actually changes.
Right.
So when, let's say an agricultural farm starts to become a subdivision, we see an actual change of use.
Right.
And so we remove it from the agricultural classification and we move it to a vacant land classification. But change of zone isn't something we use because the assessor is required to value it based on its current use. And sometimes people might be using it differently than what the zoning says, and we're not going to be policing that.
Right.
So it's not our role.
Or they may be anticipating doing something, but they haven't actually done it.
Right, absolutely. Maybe they've changed the zone so that they can do something in the future.
Yeah.
So another good question for you. It's interesting. So there's a building downtown that is it's like 4 condominium type things. So it's one building, but 4 different units within it. 3 of the units are commercial. One of them is actually residential. Mm-hmm. How the heck do you tax that?
Right.
How do you even know how to tax that?
Well, same thing. We look at it. We hopefully know the use, and hopefully somebody's communicated to us that this one unit is residential.
Say, hey, these are people living here and they're not running a business here.
Right. So we will value it based on what it would sell for. Most likely, it's still going to sell as a commercial unit because because it's in a majority commercial building, is the way you're describing it. So we'll value it based on it being able to be sold as a commercial unit, but then we'll use the statewide tax rate of residential. So they'll get the 7% rate on that when they pay tax versus the other commercial 3 units that you described. They'll get a commercial rate.
I'm hearing I might need to move into my office.
There you go. There you go. That fun little basement you got there.
Right.
All right. Well, is there anything else that you think we haven't covered that you're like, man, I wish the rank and file know this?
I would like to share one other thing. And property taxes are expensive.
Yeah.
And there are a few ways you can get a reduction on your property tax. And one is if you are a senior. So there is a statewide program. It's a senior exemption program. If you're 65 years of age or older and have owned your home for 10 years or more, you can apply for a reduction in your value, and it will save you about $500 a year in your tax. And it is worth it. And it's been in existence since, 2002. But everywhere I go, I find seniors that are unaware of that program, and it's such a savings. So no matter where I go these days, I try to communicate that don't forget, if you've lived in that home for 10 years or more, 65 years of age or older, you can get that reduction. This year, the legislature expanded the program. So if you received that in a prior home and moved since 2020, you can actually take it with you. So now let's say you moved because you want to be closer to your kids, or maybe you lived in a mountain community
huge.
and now you want to live somewhere else because you need to downsize or you need to be at a different altitude. You can take it with you, and you do have to apply again. But you can apply again and again get that $400 to $500 discount in your property tax.
That is one of those things I do educate clients on and let them know about
Thank
that. As a financial advisor, I think that's one of the ways I help add value. But the ability to take it with you, I've actually had people not move because of it.
Me too.
So to be able to take it with you, that's actually huge.
It is huge.
For them, and that's wonderful to know. Yeah. But they just have to go through the reapplication process.
You do have to reapply. It's currently only funded for 2 years. It's funded for 2026 and 2027.
Okay.
There's a bill in the legislature hopefully going to extend it. We'll have to see if that happens.
Got it.
Yeah. Okay. And this is something you have to be proactive about. You're not, because again, you're not policing in that level. So you're like, I don't know if you're 65. I don't know. I mean, maybe if I lived there for 10 years, but you don't know my age and
correct.
And all that stuff. Okay.
Correct. Yeah. And there is one other program. We've been hearing a lot that the economy is difficult. Individuals are having a hard time paying their bills, and there is a property tax deferral program. There's more information on every assessor's website. It does give you an option to not pay your property tax, and you're basically taking out a loan from the state at a low interest rate. Mm-hmm. Eventually, when you sell the property, you do have to pay it off, and there is a cap on it, but some people are really struggling in order to pay their bills, and so we're trying to make sure that everybody knows there is a property tax deferral program.
Resource for people struggling. That's
right.
really good. Mm-hmm. There's 2 things I have for you. One, I just want to, with technology the way it's going, why are we doing every 2 years and not every year?
Honestly, I think it's for stability, in order for property owners to have stability in what their tax payments are going to be.
Got it.
Value changes value can change drastically. And so
even since June, right? Like prices have
Yes.
gone down in Colorado here, and you know,
Right.
so it's just one of those questions you have. Like, we have the ability to do it. Why don't we? You know, kind of thing. Because what do you do every off year?
I know, believe it or not, we're
just hang out,
still
right?
working.
It's a little bit like asking, what do you do not on Sunday mornings, Pastor?
Are you chasing basements?
Yeah.
There's a lot. Let me just say
I
that.
know there's a lot of. I'm just giving you a hard time. So that's just, you know, it is stability. That makes sense. And then number 2, you had mentioned some dates are kind of important throughout a calendar year for your office. Like, what are those, and what do they mean?
Thank you for asking that. So May 1 is an important date. That's when you're going to get your notice of value. So you have from May 1st until June 8th in order to protest your value. So 5.5 weeks of time in order to say that your value isn't right. So when you get that notice from us in the mail, or you can sign up for an electronic notice, you should be looking at it right away and making a decision. Does this value make sense? Is this reflective of June 30th of the even year? If not, you need to appeal right away. Then the assessor, now this does vary based on where you are in the state. All of the counties that are large, so most of the Front Range counties, we all wait and listen. We make our decisions on those prior to, we just changed the date, prior to September 1st. And so you'll get notified again whether the assessor agrees with your value or not. If you don't like it, you get to appeal again. And you can appeal again after September 1st through August 15th, I believe is the date. It just changed across the state. So you get another chance to appeal your value, and then it finally gets settled around November 1st. And those are really important dates. You need to make sure that you're interacting with your value and making sure that it's within a reasonable amount, give or take a little bit, because we're never right on.
Because this podcast probably won't be out before May 1st, but just for everybody listening, that we're in an odd year of 2025.
Right.
But the June 30th, 2024
Right.
valuation determines the number that comes out May 1st.
Right.
And they have May 1st, 2025 till June 8th, 2025 to then what do you call the word?
Appeal or protest your value.
Appeal or protest, okay. And before we move on from that, like, what amount of money are we talking about is worth the time, right? Because we're talking about if it's residential and it's 7% of the number and you're saving $10,000 off of the assessed value. I mean,
I know
is it worth their time? Is it worth your time? Is there a certain, I mean, you probably can't say specifically, but hard numbers, but like, at what point is it kind of like, geez, you're saving like $2?
Right. So if you're saying $10,000 is what your assessed value is, you're talking about $100 in tax. So you have to make that decision. What is it worth for you?
So a $10,000 increment for a residential is
Yes.
roughly $100.
Yeah, something like that.
Okay, so they just have to determine if that's worth it.
Right.
Whatever the math works out, everybody, we're not checking it in front of us. So
No.
just make
Right,
sure we're not
exactly.
wrong here.
Well,
Okay,
between us, with 2 former math teachers, we should get pretty close.
Well,
Yeah.
you were applied math, if I recall.
I
And I need a calculator these days.
Yeah.
Okay, so then May 1st to June 8th, appeal, protest, and then the next date was...
Well, then you can, if you don't, you'll get a response from the assessor's office, and then if you don't like that, you can appeal again. And we'll notify you by mail again on what that decision was. And you can appeal again if you don't like it. You can actually take it all the way to the Supreme Court. It's just very rare that happens unless it's an issue of statewide concern. So usually the Supreme Court won't hear it if it's just a single property tax issue. So, and if, I said we set the value every 2 years, but if you miss that date, even though you won't get a notice of value the next year, you can still appeal. So just because you missed the first year for the value, so let's say they hear this podcast in July and they're like, oh my gosh, I should have appealed my value. They can appeal it the next year between May 1 and June 8th. And if they get a reduction, they can ask for us to go back 1 year and make that correction.
Okay.
Cool.
So they're not in the cold. I would imagine since oil and gas pays the most, they're probably the appeals the most.
Oil and gas is an interesting industry because we work with them very closely in order to make sure we're getting accurate information on the front side.
So it's probably more accurate than not then.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, because
It's just a rounding area. They're like, oh, we had a rounding area. We need to fix that. We need to appeal. Steal this probably, or something like that.
We're questioning their value and their information they're sending us as they're sending it to us, which is a little different than what we get to do with residential or commercial property owners.
Okay. Well, that's really good to know so that people kind of have an understanding of, year to year, you need to pay attention. And it's on you as a citizen to pay attention to your stuff.
It is.
Right. And if they have questions, I'm imagine they can go to the website.
Of course.
Call in.
Yes.
You guys do call-ins and stuff like that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
You can go to our website, you can call in, you can email us. All of that information is on our website, as well as easy ways to appeal. There's an online appeals form. There's an email appeals form. There's all sorts of, you can call us and talk to us about it. There's all sorts of ways to
What's
to
the
be able to
website,
contact.
just so we have that?
It's www.weld.gov. And then just look for the assessor
Very
site.
easy.
I know. Weld.
Weld.gov, assessor, everybody.
And I assume the same, similar, if not the same, in all the other counties.
Correct.
Yeah.
For Colorado.
Correct.
Yes. Well, this has been great. Oh my gosh, I always learn so much.
I know. It's fun. Thank you very much for
thank
your insight and your hard work, and good luck. When's your next election cycle?
It would be in 2026. So November of 2026 would be the election.
Got it.
In order to take the next term, 4-year term, would start 2027.
Do you get out there and campaign and stuff? Like, do you
Of course.
do that? Yeah.
That's absolutely what you have to do.
So you're out there kissing babies and shaking hands.
Again, I'm the assessor.
Hands off the baby.
Hands off the baby. We don't need you assessing that.
Well, just tell them listen to this podcast how much fun we're having. Like, Brenda, I make taxes fun.
Right.
I think that should be. I want to see that on your yard signs or whatever.
We could name the title of this "The Fun Fact of Property Tax."
The fun fact of property taxes. All right. Well, thank you, Brenda, for being with us.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, everyone at home or wherever you are for joining in. As always, like, subscribe if you're watching us on YouTube, especially. Hit the little bell so you'll be alerted when we have new episodes. And if you know somebody who has property and pays property taxes, which is a lot of people, please share this with them. That is the most helpful way you can help keep this wonderful thing going. Is share them with your friends and get us a few more audiences. We love it when people listen. We love people write in. If you got questions on a topic you want us to cover, or just a question in general about something we've already covered, we do Q&A episodes every once in a while. Do that. Send us your questions, and we will help. If we don't know the answer, we'll find somebody who does.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thank you, Roy. Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
CWA is a Securities and Exchange Registered Investment Advisor. No content contained herein should be construed as an offer for investment advice or an offer for the purchase or sale of any security, insurance, or other investment product. Investments involve the risk of low loss, including loss of principal. Please consult with a qualified financial, tax, or legal professional before implementing any strategy presented here. Data presented here are obtained from believed reliable sources but cannot be guaranteed as to completeness or accuracy.